In the golden age of Hollywood, where legends were born and careers destroyed with equal measure, one man stood apart, not for his charm or diplomacy, but for his ability to turn allies into enemies. Burt Lancaster, the towering screen icon whose intense gaze could command any scene, possessed a fatal flaw that would define his legacy in ways no Oscar ever could. Behind the carefully crafted studio portraits and glowing reviews lay a man whose pride, principles, and uncompromising nature sparked feuds that would burn for decades. From fistfights at premieres to bitter courtroom battles, Lancaster's relationships with Hollywood's elite weren't just professional disagreements. They were wars of ego, ideology, and irreconcilable differences that revealed the darker side of Tinseltown's golden era. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of Hollywood's most legendary feuds, subscribe now. Because what you're about to discover will forever change how you see the man behind the movies. Kirk Douglas, the eternal rival. The rivalry between Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas transcended mere professional competition. It was a clash of titans that would define both their careers and poison their personal lives. What began as two ambitious actors vying for the same roles evolved into something far more destructive, a blood feud that would span decades. Their first collaboration should have been the foundation of a legendary partnership. Instead, it became the opening salvo in Hollywood's most notorious war. On the set of their early films, crew members witnessed something unprecedented. Two major stars who genuinely despised each other, their animosity so palpable it infected every scene they shared. The breaking point came during a party in 1953, witnessed by dozens of Hollywood's elite. Lancaster, pushed beyond his limit by Douglas's relentless need to be the center of attention, finally exploded. What followed was a brawl so vicious that both men were arrested for disturbing the peace, a scandal that would haunt them for years. But this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. Their hatred ran deeper than professional jealousy. Lancaster saw in Douglas everything he despised about Hollywood: the shameless self-promotion, the calculated charm, the willingness to step on anyone to reach the top. Douglas, meanwhile, viewed Lancaster as a hypocrite, a man who preached integrity while harboring the same ruthless ambition. Their encounters became legendary for all the wrong reasons. At the 1960 Academy Awards, when Douglas won, Lancaster's reaction was captured by every camera in the room, a look of such pure contempt that it became the defining image of their relationship. Years passed, both men achieved tremendous success, yet neither could escape the shadow of their mutual hatred. Even in their later years, when age might have softened their animosity, the wound remained fresh. They had become prisoners of their own pride, forever locked in a battle that neither could win and neither could walk away from. John Wayne, the political battlefield. In an era when Hollywood began to find its political voice, no two stars embodied the nation's cultural divide more than Burt Lancaster and John Wayne. Their conflict wasn't born in green rooms or on movie sets. It erupted from the deepest fault lines of American society, making their personal animosity a reflection of a country at war with itself. Wayne represented the old guard, conservative, patriotic, unwavering in his belief that America's traditional values were under siege. Lancaster stood for something entirely different: progress, civil rights, and the belief that Hollywood had a responsibility to lead social change. When these two worldviews collided, the explosion was inevitable. The first public shots were fired in the pages of Life magazine, where Wayne launched a scathing attack on Lancaster and other liberal stars, calling them rebels trying to tear down the values this country was built on. It was a declaration of war that Lancaster couldn't ignore. His response in The Hollywood Reporter was equally brutal. Hollywood isn't a place to preserve outdated ideas. We have a responsibility to lead society forward, not to sneer at those trying to change the world. But their feud went beyond newspaper interviews. During the tumultuous 1960s, As America grappled with civil rights in Vietnam, their political battles became personal vendettas. At industry events, they would deliberately avoid each other, their mutual contempt so obvious that other guests felt the tension. When forced into the same room, their exchanges were arctic, two legends reduced to bitter enemies by their irreconcilable beliefs. The moment that crystallized their hatred came at the 1970 Academy Awards. When Wayne won his long-overdue Oscar, Lancaster did the unthinkable. He turned his back and refused to acknowledge the victory. The silence in the room was deafening, and everyone knew they were witnessing the end of any possibility of reconciliation. Their feud became symbolic of America's own struggles, two giants whose inability to find common ground reflected a nation divided against itself. Marlon Brando, the artistic adversary. When the method-acting revolution swept through Hollywood in the 1950s, it brought with it a new kind of star, one who challenged every convention the industry had built. Marlon Brando embodied this rebellion, and to Burt Lancaster, who had climbed to stardom through discipline and traditional craftsmanship, Brando represented everything wrong with the new Hollywood. Their philosophical divide ran deeper than acting techniques. Lancaster, who treated his craft with religious devotion, couldn't comprehend Brando's casual relationship with fame and responsibility. While Lancaster arrived on set prepared, punctual, and professional, Brando seemed to view such dedication as antiquated, even laughable. The public first glimpsed their animosity in 1962 when Brando dismissed Lancaster in a New York Times interview as a star Hollywood propped up like a grinning doll. The insult cut deep, not just for its cruelty, but for what it represented. The old guard being swept aside by a new generation that had no respect for the struggles of those who came before. Lancaster's retaliation was swift and merciless. In his own interview with The Hollywood Reporter, he didn't just criticize Brando's methods, he attacked his character. Marlon is an undisciplined wild child. He doesn't understand what hard work really means. Has he ever thought about people like me who sacrifice for work, for art? Brando just lives in indulgence. Their conflict reached its peak during a live television appearance in 1965. When asked about Brando's lifestyle, Lancaster unleashed years of pent-up frustration. Marlon is a symbol of destruction. He's not an artist. He's a self-deluded man, lost in fantasies about himself. The comments shocked viewers and created a scandal that dominated Hollywood headlines for weeks. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of their feud was what it represented. Two brilliant artists whose mutual hatred prevented any possibility of collaboration. Cinema lost the chance to witness what might have been one of the greatest partnerships in film history, sacrificed on the altar of pride and incompatible philosophies. Joan Crawford, the backstage manipulator. Hollywood had seen difficult stars before, but Joan Crawford elevated backstage manipulation to an art form. When she found herself working with Burt Lancaster on Autumn Leaves in 1956, she encountered something she rarely faced, a leading man who refused to be intimidated by her legendary temperament. From the first day of shooting, Crawford launched a campaign designed to establish her dominance over every aspect of production. She critiqued Lancaster's performances, demanded retakes without justification, and used her influence to create an atmosphere of constant tension. What she didn't anticipate was that Lancaster, unlike many of her previous co-stars, would fight back. The battles were both public and private. On set, Crawford would throw furniture when Lancaster questioned her demands, creating scenes that brought production to a halt. Behind closed doors, she manipulated directors and producers, pushing for script changes designed specifically to diminish Lancaster's role and elevate her own. But Crawford's most insidious weapon was psychological warfare. She understood that Lancaster took immense pride in his professionalism, so she attacked that foundation. Every costume choice, every line delivery, every gesture became subject to her criticism, not to improve the film, but to erode his confidence and establish her supremacy. Lancaster endured the abuse for months, maintaining his dignity while colleagues watched in horror. Finally, he reached his breaking point. In a 1957 Variety interview that shocked the industry, he exposed Crawford's methods. "Hollywood isn't a place for people like Joan Crawford who don't understand real work. She doesn't respect those around her, only wants to control everything her way. She turned our set into hell." The public revelation devastated Crawford's reputation and marked the beginning of the end of her reign as Hollywood's most feared diva. But for Lancaster, the victory came at a cost. He had been forced to compromise his own principles of discretion and professionalism to defend himself against an enemy who recognized no boundaries. Their feud demonstrated that even in Hollywood's carefully constructed world of glamour and romance, some conflicts were too bitter to hide behind studio publicity. Tony Curtis, the courtroom warrior. The collaboration between Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis on Sweet Smell of Success should have been a meeting of minds, two talented actors at the height of their powers, creating what would become a film noir classic. Instead, it became the opening chapter in one of Hollywood's most destructive feuds, a battle that would ultimately require legal intervention to resolve. Curtis represented everything Lancaster found troubling about the new generation of stars. Where Lancaster demanded discipline and structure, Curtis brought a free-spirited approach that prioritized creativity over protocol. Their working styles weren't just different, they were fundamentally incompatible, creating friction that made every scene a struggle. The tension erupted publicly in 1958 when Curtis launched a devastating attack in Variety. "He's like a machine, always demanding perfection. We are not men of the past. Hollywood needs refreshers, those who can break the mold, not people clinging to what's old." The criticism struck at Lancaster's deepest insecurities about his place in a rapidly changing industry. But Curtis wasn't content to limit his attacks to interviews. He began questioning Lancaster's authority on set, challenging his decisions, and rallying younger crew members to his cause. What had begun as a professional disagreement evolved into a generational war, with Lancaster representing the old Hollywood establishment and Curtis embodying the rebellious spirit of the emerging era. The conflict reached its nadir when their disputes over creative control and financial terms made continued collaboration impossible. In March 1960, their battle moved to the Los Angeles County Courthouse, where two of Hollywood's biggest stars aired their grievances before a judge and jury. The trial became a media circus, with reporters chronicling every accusation and counter-accusation. The Hollywood Reporter observed that Hollywood may have lost a valuable collaboration, but the battle between Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis has unleashed an unstoppable storm. When the legal dust settled, both men had won their respective points, but lost something far more valuable. Their relationship was irreparably damaged, a casualty of egos too large to coexist and pride too deep to compromise. Burt Reynolds. The Replacement. By the 1970s, Burt Lancaster faced a challenge more devastating than any rival or critic: obsolescence. The industry that had elevated him to legendary status was moving beyond him, embracing a new kind of leading man epitomized by Burt Reynolds. The transition wasn't just professional, it was generational, and Lancaster watched helplessly as everything he had built began to slip away. Reynolds burst onto the scene with an effortless charisma that made Lancaster's intensity seem antiquated. Where Lancaster had commanded respect through discipline and gravitas, Reynolds won audiences with humor and accessibility. His success in films like Smokey and the Bandit and The Longest Yard proved that the action genre Lancaster had dominated was evolving beyond his reach. The younger star's rise might have been easier to accept if Reynolds had shown respect for those who paved his path. Instead, he seemed to take pleasure in dismissing the previous generation. In a 1978 Hollywood Reporter interview, Reynolds delivered a particularly cutting blow. Burt isn't the only one in Hollywood who knows how to make action films anymore. His time has passed. The comment wasn't just insulting, it was prophetic. Lancaster found himself being offered smaller roles, fewer opportunities, and diminished billing. The man who had once been Hollywood's most bankable action star was being systematically replaced by someone younger, more marketable, and increasingly contemptuous of his legacy. Their encounters at industry events became exercises in humiliation for Lancaster. Reynolds, surrounded by admirers and flush with success, would barely acknowledge the veteran star whose path he had followed to fame. Lancaster, meanwhile, struggled with feelings he had never experienced: inadequacy, irrelevance, and the bitter realization that his era was ending. The psychological impact of being replaced proved more damaging than any physical confrontation. Lancaster had survived countless feuds by fighting back, but how do you battle time itself? Reynolds represented not just a rival, but an inevitability, the future arriving to claim its place while pushing the past into shadow. Rock Hudson, The Hidden Truth. Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s operated on carefully maintained illusions, none more elaborate than the fiction surrounding Rock Hudson's personal life. The handsome leading man was marketed as every woman's dream. But Lancaster knew the truth behind the facade, and that knowledge bred a contempt that went far beyond professional rivalry. Lancaster, raised in an era when masculinity was defined by rigid standards, couldn't reconcile Hudson's public image with his private reality. The carefully orchestrated studio dates, the manufactured romances, the entire machinery of deception offended Lancaster's sense of authenticity. To him, Hudson represented everything false about Hollywood's star system. Their mutual antagonism was complicated by rumors that Lancaster himself had once been involved in a same-sex relationship early in his career, an experience that allegedly ended in humiliation and shame. If true, Hudson's ability to navigate similar territory while maintaining his career success may have served as a painful reminder of Lancaster's own buried secrets. The tension manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. At industry gatherings, Lancaster would make pointed comments about real men and authentic stars, while Hudson maintained his characteristic silence. Their few professional interactions were marked by Lancaster's barely concealed hostility and Hudson's diplomatic efforts to avoid confrontation. Lancaster's friends reported that he viewed Hudson as a symbol of Hollywood's moral decay, a man who had achieved stardom through deception, while others succeeded through talent and hard work. "Hollywood needs transparency," Lancaster once confided, "and Hudson represents everything I don't want to see in this industry." The tragedy of their relationship lay not just in Lancaster's bigotry, but in the hypocrisy it potentially revealed. If the rumors about Lancaster's own past were true, his hatred of Hudson may have been less about moral outrage than about self-loathing, a man attacking in others what he couldn't accept in himself. Their story illuminated the impossible pressures of Hollywood's closeted era, when careers could be destroyed by truth and survival often required living a lie. Lee Marvin, the professional anarchist. Lee Marvin approached acting like a force of nature, unpredictable, powerful, and utterly indifferent to conventional rules. When he collided with Burt Lancaster's meticulously ordered world during the filming of The Professionals in 1966, the result was a clash between two fundamentally incompatible philosophies of work and life. Lancaster had built his career on discipline, preparation, and unwavering professionalism. Every scene was rehearsed, every gesture calculated, every moment on set treated with the reverence of a sacred ritual. Marvin, by contrast, seemed to view such dedication as unnecessary and even counterproductive to genuine creativity. Their first major confrontation occurred when Marvin arrived late to a crucial scene, apparently unconcerned about keeping the entire cast and crew waiting. When Lancaster confronted him, Marvin's casual dismissal of the incident and of Lancaster's concerns triggered an explosion that witnesses described as shocking in its intensity. He understands nothing about seriousness at work and has no respect for the principles I have devoted my life to, Lancaster raged in a later interview. The comment revealed the depth of his frustration with a man who seemed to mock everything he held sacred about their profession. Marvin's response was characteristically blunt. In a 1967 Variety interview, he dismissed Lancaster's methods with devastating efficiency. "Burt's the kind of guy you have to pass through a dozen checkpoints to work with. I don't like that." The words were chosen to wound, suggesting that Lancaster's professionalism was actually a form of neurosis. Their mutual animosity extended beyond the workplace. At parties and industry events, they would studiously avoid each other, their dislike so obvious that other guests felt uncomfortable. When forced to interact, their exchanges were cold, formal, and laden with barely suppressed hostility. The feud between Lancaster and Marvin represented more than a personality conflict. It embodied the tension between Hollywood's old guard and the rebellious new generation that was reshaping American cinema in the 1960s and 70s. Charlton Heston, the political apostate. Few betrayals cut deeper than the loss of a trusted friend, and Charlton Heston's transformation from ally to ideological enemy left Burt Lancaster feeling not just disappointed, but personally wounded. Their friendship, forged through successful collaborations and shared experiences, crumbled under the weight of irreconcilable political differences that reflected America's own cultural divisions. In their early years, Lancaster and Heston had been natural allies, serious actors committed to their craft and conscious of their responsibilities as public figures. They had worked together successfully, socialized regularly, and maintained the kind of mutual respect that seemed destined to last throughout their careers. The fracture began slowly, as Heston gradually embraced conservative causes that Lancaster found increasingly objectionable. The man who had once portrayed Moses with such dignity now seemed to Lancaster like a reactionary voice, defending the very injustices they both had once opposed. Heston's vocal support for gun rights, military intervention, and traditional social structures put him at odds with Lancaster's progressive activism. Their final break came at an MGM party in 1968, when Heston launched into a passionate defense of conservative values, dismissing the civil rights and anti-war movements that Lancaster championed as destructive and disorderly. The attack wasn't just political, it was personal, striking at causes Lancaster had supported at considerable risk to his own career. Lancaster's response was immediate and devastating. "You don't understand what's happening in society. What you're saying is no different from the reactionary voices of conservatives trying to preserve oppression." The exchange marked the end of their friendship and the beginning of a bitter estrangement that would last for decades. What made their feud particularly painful was the sense of betrayal it represented. Lancaster hadn't just lost a colleague. He had watched a friend transform into everything he opposed, leaving him feeling isolated in an industry that seemed to be abandoning the values he held dear. Elizabeth Taylor, the unrequited obsession. Among all of Burt Lancaster's complicated relationships, perhaps none was more psychologically damaging than his unrequited feelings for Elizabeth Taylor. Unlike his other feuds, which were fueled by professional rivalry or ideological differences, his anguish over Taylor was rooted in something far more personal and painful: the slow realization that he would never possess what he most desired. Taylor represented everything Lancaster found irresistible: beauty, talent, and an intoxicating vulnerability that made him want to protect her. During their professional interactions, he allowed himself to believe that their on-screen chemistry might translate into something more meaningful off-camera. He misread her warmth as affection, her professionalism as personal interest. The fantasy collapsed when Taylor began her legendary romance with Richard Burton. Lancaster was forced to watch as the woman he secretly loved became half of Hollywood's most celebrated couple, their passionate affair dominating headlines and making their co-star feel invisible by comparison. The pain of rejection was compounded by professional humiliation. Suddenly, Lancaster found himself relegated to supporting roles in a narrative dominated by Burton and Taylor. Producers wanted the star couple, not the aging actor whose feelings had been reduced to an embarrassing footnote in their love story. Lancaster's friends reported that he never fully recovered from the experience. "She was the queen of Hollywood, and I was nothing more than a shadow in her presence," became his private torment. The man who had commanded respect through strength and authority discovered that such qualities meant nothing when faced with the simple fact of unreturned love. The Taylor-Burton phenomenon didn't just break Lancaster's heart, it broke his confidence. He began to doubt his appeal, his relevance, and his place in an industry that seemed to be moving beyond him. What started as romantic disappointment evolved into an existential crisis, leaving scars that no amount of professional success could heal. Their story illustrated the destructive power of one-sided passion, showing how even the strongest personalities can be devastated by love that exists only in their own imagination. The feuds that defined Burt Lancaster's career reveal more than just the temperament of one difficult star. They illuminate the fundamental tensions that shaped Hollywood's golden age. Each conflict, whether born from professional rivalry, political differences, or personal disappointments, exposed the costs of uncompromising integrity in an industry built on compromise. Lancaster's inability to bend, to accommodate, to simply get along ultimately isolated him from many of his most talented contemporaries. His feuds weren't aberrations, they were inevitable outcomes of a personality that demanded excellence from others and refused to accept anything less from himself. In Hollywood's ecosystem of egos and ambitions, such rigidity was both his greatest strength and his most fatal weakness. Perhaps the tragedy of Lancaster's relationships wasn't that he made so many enemies, but that his enemies were often as talented and principled as he was. Kirk Douglas, John Wayne, Marlon Brando, these weren't petty rivals, but giants of cinema whose conflicts with Lancaster deprived audiences of collaborations that might have redefined American film. Yet there's something admirable about a man who chose principle over popularity, authenticity over acceptance. In an industry notorious for its superficiality and moral flexibility, Lancaster stood for something, even when that something made him impossible to work with. His feuds were the price he paid for never betraying his own convictions. What do you think? Was Burt Lancaster a principled man destroyed by Hollywood's compromises, or a difficult star who created his own isolation? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age.